to everyone at our very first webinar recording for Dealerfloor. Dealerfloor is a platform specifically for information to dealers, sharing and celebrating dealer achievements and giving some industry insights. And this is exactly what we are here for today. Our industry insights, or in our travels and chats with dealers across South Africa, we heard that there's definitely a lot of fraud out there, or risk of fraud, a lot of fraudulent activities. And so we came knocking to the door of 3 of South Africa's industry specialists to help us understand this a little bit better. So starting on my side from ladies first, Jeanette Richardson is a Chief Operating Officer at AC Motor, or Associated Compliance Motor, and she's definitely got her feet on the ground in terms of fraud and what's happening out there. Mark Domiser is our National Chair of the National Automotive Dealer Association, NADA, and also CEO of North Motor Group. And then Kreben Reddy is Vice President, and Kreben, please help me there, Vice President looking after Consumer and Auto Information Solutions, if I'm not mistaken.
100%.
Perfect. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And we'd like to just have a rough chat about what's happening out there in terms of fraud and what we're seeing on the dealer level, how are dealers being targeted, what can dealers do to address that. And so maybe just to start, Kreben, we had an interesting chat just the other day about what you're seeing out there. TransUnion probably has a better view of the market than most, and both on the consumer side and on the corporate side. So what have you seen in terms of what's happening out there with fraud and phishing and identity theft?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Yeah, so the first thing I think I'll make the comment that this might be heightened both on the consumer and from a business perspective, some of these instances of fraud, but these certainly have been around for a while, right? And some of these things are getting more picked up. So if you look at data breaches as an example, the reason why we hear about it now more in the public domain is because as part of POPIA, businesses have to disclose back to their customers or put it out in the public domain if they had a breach or not. So a lot of these things, we might just be unaware of it, but trust me, it's been happening for years, every single day. And, the dealer space is quite interesting because they've been targets, for many years around a number of different tactics that fraudsters would use. I just want to share with you quickly something that we've been doing for a while. I'll share my screen so you can have a look at it. Just tell me when you can see.
There we go. We can see your screen.
I'll just increase it. So, as part of TransUnion, we obviously operate to consumers directly, and then we've got various solutions with businesses as well. One of the things that we've been doing specifically under COVID is that we've been canvassing and surveying cohorts of consumers and small and medium businesses and large businesses as well, just around the general theme of financial hardship. And through the questioning, we've also included some things around identity theft or fraud, etc. And I'll just share quickly with you some of the stats that we've actually been picking up. So this is the first thing that consumers were asked around fraud. So one, we see that they are increasingly becoming targeted by fraudsters, and this is specifically around identity theft. And what this shows you is that through the different stages of COVID, as we've been canvassing or surveying them, we've actually seen a rise and an increase in consumers saying that they did experience some form of being, a phishing attack or some attempt was made on them to defraud them. And then also, did they become victims or not? And 8% of the last, if you look at the last wave, 8% of that base said they actually did fall victim. Now, what's interesting here is that, when someone falls victim to identity theft, there's actually two victims. One is the consumer, but then this data or information itself also gets used to defraud a business. And that's how some of these things get perpetrated, right? The second is just, we then are running it across multiple regions, across our entire group. And you can see what's interesting here is that South Africa actually ranks high in comparison to developed economies. And visually, you would think that a region like Brazil or Colombia, etc., even Dominican Republic would actually rank higher. South Africa is actually in line with most of those regions around the fraud activity that we're picking up. I'll share with you just something we also looked at around the different types of fraud that's being picked up, and has these instances and these types or segments of fraud increased during COVID and during the periods that we were surveying these customers. So we looked at identity theft, synthetic identity theft, account takeover, first-party fraud and potential fraud. And you can see that there's been significant shifts on all of these different segments of or types of fraud across the time period. Although identity theft still has the greatest portion of all the different types of fraud, identity theft still has by far outweighs the other different types. And I guess, in terms of the current economic climate, the financial hardship that consumers are going under, you would expect that this would be a key one. And then we look at just in general, I'll share this point as well because it's actually an interesting one, around the different types of devices that are used. So we looked at desktop versus mobile, etc. So while you see that there's not much shift or big change between the different ones, it's interesting that mobile, which is probably not a strange fact at all, but mobile still carries almost 50% of where the fraud actually comes from. Just in terms of the top 5 trends that we see in 2020 around fraud activity, the first is authorized push, or what's known as authorized push payment fraud or wire transfer. And this is, there's some interesting examples, and anecdotally, we've got some examples from clients, etc. But one of the scenarios is where, the fraudster almost impersonates that an email is coming from the CEO of the business. They get sent to the CFO as an example, pushing for a certain payment on an account, but obviously the entire transaction is fraudulent. Transaction payment also comes up, as well as account opening fraud, account takeover fraud, and synthetic identity. And I think the last one I'll just share with you, which is actually very relevant to South Africa, and this was by a recent study at PwC. But you can see it's not just a single perpetrator, or necessarily that it's all coming from external, fraudsters, etc. A lot of the activity and the syndicate activity is perpetrated by having also people within our businesses, and overwhelmingly, 60% of transactions we picked up or that was picked up in this period actually happened through having an internal perpetrator, and the collusion between the two is what contributed to most of the economic crime.
So, Kriben, from what I read in this presentation of yours, it looks like it started a couple of months ago, maybe pre-COVID or around COVID, that we started seeing identity theft happening a bit more. And that's now being used by these syndicates to start targeting dealers through this kind of synthetic fraud. Would that be correct?
Absolutely spot on.
Mark, if I can come to you, I just speaking about this kind of fraud, and you've got your finger on the pulse of what dealers are doing, and you're chatting to a lot of dealers out there. Do you see this happening? Do you see that fraud's picking up? And is it a product of our current economic climate?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously a lot of pressure out there, but I think we are seeing it more and more. The tough one and the riskiest one, there are many risky ones, but the stolen identity one is difficult. We had an example the other day where we had an approval, the banks had all validated everything, go ahead with the deal, and the customer actually got an SMS from the insurance company or something about, it was either cancellation of insurance, whatever it was. So that the syndicate had actually been already there, ready to go, take the vehicle, and the customer was the one that found out about it last.
Sure.
So these syndicates are really, really sharp. But yeah, so I think these are happening more and more. The classic interception of banking details is rampantly happening, and I think that's a really risky one for dealers as well. Yeah. And then there's all the old classics like confirmation of funds. People trying to and ask for refunds. And then also, dealerships just plain old trying to steal the car. That classic still works quite well. There's valuable assets on the dealership floor, and that's another area. So dealerships, they really do come. There are places of high value, and unfortunately, we are soft targets.
And do you see this a higher risk of this happening now than say before COVID? Do you see this more happening at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, realistically, with people working from home, I just don't, that might pose a bit of a risk. I think the banks have got a lot more work to do with their validation processes and everything when everyone's not in the same place. So that might be a bit of a risk. And I think just the economic times are down. We're always seeing that every year. When there are recessions, we are more vulnerable to theft. We've got much more risk at the moment.
Ruben, if I can perhaps just turn back to you for a second there. You mentioned now the different types of fraud, and you've got fraud that addresses that's an individual. Say, I'm faking my income so that I can buy a more expensive car, and then you've got fraud perpetrated by syndicates that either use an individual, a real person that they've created a profile for or a bank account, or then the synthetic type fraud that you were mentioning. Could you just expand on those two types of fraud before maybe I ask Jeanette on some real examples of how that's happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Mark makes some good points right around the current activity and what's happening. There's some of the things that we pick up that are very specific to a dealership. I think the first thing I'll say is that the entire dealer model and why it opens them up is, a little bit more is because it's actually quite complex fraud that can happen, because you're not just dealing with the consumer or a possible fraudster trying to impersonate someone to take on finance and then steal the car. Fraud can happen in so many different ways, I think, in the dealer environment. So on the consumer side, absolutely, you can have synthetic ID being created or legitimately a single individual's identity being stolen to then take on finance to obviously then get the asset or the finance paid out or whatever the case is. But then you also, from a dealer perspective, open yourself up on the asset itself. So some of the things we're seeing is that fraudsters use the dealer network as a distribution channel to get cloned and stolen vehicles back into the market. So you'll find things like falsified NATIS documents coming through. Obviously, accompanied with that, false identity documents attached to it as showing that they owner or legitimate owner of the vehicle. One of the things that we always periods of when you have people emigrating or moving out of the country is that one of the biggest issues that have always faced the industry as a whole is trying to understand that the vehicle is currently under finance, as an example. So if the banks then somebody is emigrating, they've got the vehicle financed. It even could be, someone would have been legitimately a normal consumer, but now they find an opportunity because, you're going to leave the country in a week. You don't disclose that the vehicle is currently under finance, as it were. A dealer pays you out cash for that vehicle. The person leaves the country, the bank now starts looking for the vehicle, as an example. So there's a number of different ways, I think, both related to the consumer and then the asset itself, that actually dealers fall victim to.
And this is then, as you mentioned, on an individual level. For instance, I'm immigrating and I sell my car, not telling the dealer that it's still under finance. And then you have the syndicate issue where it's a criminal element that is organized. They have a whole operation behind them to try and defraud a dealer, either out of one vehicle or then a whole fleet of vehicles. Jeanette, maybe if you can mention some of those examples. You've had some wonderful examples prior to this discussion of what you're seeing out there happening in the market. So can you perhaps expand on this, the individual versus the syndicate fraud?
Yeah, absolutely, Leo. You must remember, the syndicates, I immediately think of what Winston Churchill has said, and never let a good crisis go to waste. And the syndicates has certainly capitalized on this. We all know that the motor industry has been under economic pressure for quite a while. The pandemic has exacerbated the situation and has really provided them with an opportunity on a silver platter to defraud dealerships, which is extremely sad. Specifically when everybody is down and out and really need to get the metal off the floor to feed their own families. So what we've seen at the various dealers that's been victim of fraudulent deals is certainly identity theft that goes hand in hand with profile creation. Off-site deliveries is a problem. I mean, the pandemic has given the syndicates the perfect excuse to take delivery of a vehicle off-site in the parking lot of a shopping center. And the reason is just, I fear for my health and that of my family. So they can insist on an off-site delivery, which becomes a problem. Deliveries before long weekends and on Fridays, that's also something that raise a couple of questions. Spotters that gets involved in fraudulent deals, the buy now, pay later transactions and cashback deals. These are all deals to entice the client, the man on the street, to come and purchase a vehicle. And the syndicates know this. They keep a very close watch on the motor industry, and I promise you, if they see a gap, they take it. So yeah, these are the things that I certainly think that the motor guys need to be wary of.
Maybe just we're staying with you for a second there. Do we see this trend happening across South Africa at the same time, or can you pick up that it's happening at certain regions or certain areas, say certain cities or provinces at a point, and then they move on when we talk about these syndicates?
Yes, Leo, you know, these guys are clever. They target a certain area and they really milk it for as long as they can. And the moment they see that there's a change in the client take-on process and the people are onto them, they move into another area and give this area a rest, and then they'll go back. So what they also do, which is extremely concerning, is they do target they capitalize on the desperation of dealers to make a sale. We do get situations where individuals would turn a blind eye to a identification, verification, or client take-on process purely to make a sale. And it's not because they want to empower the fraudster. It's really desperation to get money in their own bank accounts to feed their families. So they do hop, skip, and jump from one area to another area, definitely. They do get inside information in certain instances. And I do have a couple of examples that I'll share with you a little bit later if you give me an opportunity to do so.
Love that. Greben, Jeanette's now mentioned the verification and take-on procedure, and I know that there's certain tools that you can use to protect yourself. Could you perhaps just take us through some? I know that TransUnion's got quite a few such tools like that. What would you necessarily dealer if you are worried about fraud or a syndicate, or just in general to do a deal?
Yeah, look, I think earlier the first comment I'll make before I get into the actual tool is that I think generally there's got to be a behavior shift within the usage of these tools as well, right? Because you can have whatever tool you want. If it's not being used effectively, it's not going to solve the problem anywhere, right? And what you find generally is that sometimes these things are used, but used where it's, you cherry pick and only check a specific vehicle if you think there might be fraudulent activity around it, or a certain customer that looks to appear like they might be, have a propensity to commit fraud, etc. And certainly under the current times, that becomes a challenge because you actually don't know, and as much as gut feel is an input into the whole thing, you need some objective tools also and data points and insights to help you and guide different users in the dealer environment. So, from a TransUnion perspective, we've got a range of products, and what's nice is that, depending on the size of the dealer, the complexity of their own processes, etc., they can choose to use an interface of ours or plug certain components in where they feel they need to use it. But I'll start with the simplest one. So we've had a mobile application out into the dealer networks probably since around 2011, 2012 or so. And the one thing that it solves for in terms of identity theft, that is, it allows you to scan the driver's license of an individual. And immediately once you scan this, so the first thing is that just from an eyeball perspective, everything that's embedded in the driver's license is actually stored in the barcode of the driver's license, which is almost impossible to tamper with. So once you scan that off a mobile device, any mobile device, you just scan the driver's license, immediately you can reference the person in front of you or whatever information you have about that individual, because you're also operating digitally, versus what's on the driver's license itself. And remember, even through test drive processes, etc., there's risk and fraud, not just at the point when the finance application is happening. And then you also reference back what actually comes off the barcode. If those three things don't match, immediately it's cause for concern and you should take the necessary action. So in its simplest form, we allow dealers to use that mobile app. Once we gather information off the driver's license, we then also verify and validate identity using either the Home Affairs database. We can even pull the image of the individual stored at Home Affairs as an example. And then we also reference it back to our own internal proprietary fraud model. So we can pick up, as an example, syndicate activity linked to a particular cell phone number or identity number, etc. And what we put out to the dealer is a score that says, it's either 1 to 5. If it's a 1, the person's green. We haven't picked up any fraudulent activity, or we don't have any cause for concern based on the data that we have. If it's anything higher, we'll actually give you the reason and actually tell you. So it could be as simple as, the name and surname you have doesn't match to the identity number that's stored at Home Affairs. So it is various degrees and varied levels of the data that gets back and gets returned. And then the dealer can choose what process or route to take based on that. The full extent of the complexity or sophistication of the tools actually extends right, and it's more relevant now in the current context as well, but it can extend right into solutions that help solve for non-face-to-face FICA compliance and KYC checks, right through to the anti-money laundering checks, identity establishment, all the way through to any of the screening that needs to be done, etc. And all of that can be done virtually, through a mobile application or whatever interface is chosen. But there's definitely a range. On the vehicle side, I'll just quickly tell you, when we can check if a vehicle, according to the manufacturer, what's the engine linked to the VIN. We can check if a vehicle is currently stolen and being sought for by the police, any indications of that the vehicle was cloned. So equally also on the consumer and on the vehicle side, there's a range of checks that can be done.
So just putting you on the spot there for another second, I played around with some of these tools. I mean, another one that I recently played with is on FloorFin. They have a similar tool that you can scan a driver's license, for instance, or an identity card. With it being quite easy and quite digital these days, why would some dealers still hold back on that? Is it because, as you said, Jeanette, that they just want to get this deal? Or is it just a case of being, you've got a bulk of work and you need to get through all these deals? I mean, why would one not use those tools available to yourself?
I think there's possibly a couple of reasons. I mean, all the points that Jeanette made is definitely valid, right? Dealers just they're in their nature, their core role is to sell vehicles, right? So part of the compliance becomes a challenge, especially under the current context when sales is critical and sales volumes are declining. So you want to get the vehicle or move the metal through the doors, right? That's the first thing. The second, it could be that, there's costs and all dealers now across, all industries really, right, are taking on a more cost-conscious approach, especially with lower sales volumes, etc. The challenge, though, is that one, if you're part of a bigger group and you lose a vehicle, you possibly might have cover across the group. You might have various different ways to leverage off the group structure to help you. But if you look at an independent dealer, etc., and some of these dealers are funding their own floor plans or funding their own stock levels, etc. If you lose a vehicle or two, you could be out of business. Right? That's the real reality of the situation, that we deal with. So to spend a few rand on making sure that you're checking every customer it's certainly more worthwhile. But I think the overall point is, generally across the industry, we have to do a lot more to educate at all levels, right? That these tools exist. This is what they can be used for. This is, the ease of how they can be used and implemented. I think that there's also a lot of work that needs to be done at that level as well.
Thank you. And then just moving to Mark, from a dealer point of view, I know we spoke about the tools now and the technology that's available to verify people, but from a dealer gut feel point of view, I mean, are there some things that dealers have to look out for to tell them about fraudulent deals? Because as Kriben said, especially the smaller independents, you are at risk both by losing that asset and then you have that finance and the bank asking for that money. So are there some things that dealers can do just from a gut feel or a practice point of view to protect themselves against this fraud?
Yeah, I think Jeanette touched on it earlier. Unfortunately, a sales department in a dealership is always going to conflict with procedure. And I think wherever these leaks happen or fraud happens in a dealership, it's generally because someone hasn't stuck to the process. Unfortunately, processes take time, and people don't necessarily always understand them. But little things like verifying funds in the bank and those kinds of things, you don't really need a complicated procedure to do that, but you do need the procedure. So I think that the big challenge with this, you can have all the tools in the world, but when a guy says, listen, I'll bring my driver's license when I get to the dealership, I'll do it on the day. And, these syndicates do these things very well. And don't worry, the money's coming and the bank's coming, and they're lining you up for a Friday afternoon on month end and all these kinds of things. That's where it gets quite difficult. And the natural pressure of a dealership to cross the line is where these things sort of get taken advantage of. So yeah, I think the areas that dealers have to sit and invest in is procedure and process. And unfortunately, these things get run by the back office, get run by the accountant, get run by the DP and the F&I. And if you stick to those processes, you aren't going to have anything really, really bad happen to you. So that's kind of where my take is on it.
Just on that, is your weakest link normally your F&I? Is that where the process is normally jippoed, or is it?
No, I don't necessarily think so. Unless you have a weak F&I, I think your weakest link generally is, I find your salespeople are a weaker link. Because ultimately, if the salesperson just wants to deliver the car, they need to ask the F&I. They can just get in the car and go and deliver it because they think, they can sort of, take a view there. So I think your sales departments, I'm not looking at the F&I as a sales department. I think your people in charge of a sales department can be your weakest link, and a salesperson that just doesn't like procedure. And then from the top, if your dealer principal is one of process and he or she is strong in that department, then the tone from the top in the dealership is going to come down. So I think that pressure on sales that Jeanette was talking about earlier is a huge thing that can really make or break your department, and a good accounting department as well.
Perfect. I see we're running up close to 30 minutes. Jeanette, you had some examples that I'd love you to touch on, and then we'll just discuss that in brief. But some of the ways in which dealers are being targeted, if you could perhaps just give us some ideas of what are the warning signs that dealers should be looking out for.
Okay, so firstly, please be very careful if a client doesn't want to give you documents to do identification and verification. That immediately is a red flag. Then when you do the identification and verification, or the client take-on process, as Mark has said, and Chris has explained beautifully, Kriban has explained it beautifully, how the system works. So that client take-on process should actually happen once the client says, I want the car. Then it will avoid the bottleneck at the end of the month where the identification and verification needs to happen very quickly. We've come across a very interesting identity theft situation with a specific spotter, and it also talks to some of the examples that Kriban mentioned earlier in his presentation. What this guy does is he creates a profile for a client on a free email account service like a Gmail or a Hotmail or Yahoo, one of those. And he also creates a cell number for a couple of profiles of clients. And then he applies for finance in the name of those fraudulent those identity theft clients at the banks, or at the F&Is electronically, and the finance is all approved. When they get the electronic documents, contracts from the banks, it is then sent to that email account service, that free email account that was created. The OTP pin is sent to the cell number that is used just every now and then. Everything's sorted out, and then he sends an email to the dealership as if he's the client, saying to the dealership, sure, but I can't collect the vehicle. I am going to send this person, being the spotter, to come and collect the vehicle on my behalf. So he goes, he collects the vehicle, and the fraudulent transaction is concluded. Now, from what I understand, and Kriban, you need to please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the TransUnion identification and verification process can also check whether the email account and the telephone number is valid, or when they were created and how long they've been active. So that in itself gives you an indication that, hold on, we're sitting with a problem here. These oaks that asked you to do offsite deliveries, please be very careful. That identification and verification process must be done before the salesperson or the person that's delivering the vehicle gets in his car to drive there. Now, we're sitting with another situation. If we do the identification and verification and we check and everything's hunky-dory and off they go and they deliver the vehicle, and the salesperson stands there and he sees on the document that he's got in front of him that the person taking delivery is different, I'm sure as hell not going to tell him you're a fraudster, because I don't know who else is sitting in the cars next door, and I might lose my life. So you have to do that identification and verification as quickly as possible to pick up if there's problems. Then the identity theft and the profiling. What these oaks also do is they make use of homeless people that's got South African IDs and used to have a valid driver's license once upon a time before everything went pear-shaped. And they clean them up and they create a profile for these oaks. So they will create salary slips and a bank account, and they'll deposit money into the bank account as a salary, and they'll go and do shopping at Spar and Checkers and all those type of things to create a very nice financial profile for that specific individual. And then assist that person to apply for finance. And once the finance is approved, they take delivery. And from what I hear is that the syndicates pay these runners, these homeless people, 5,000 Rand per vehicle that's successfully delivered. Now, you might immediately think, how on earth do you get a homeless person or a person that's stolen my ID? How do you get a driver's license? It's very easy. It's too simple, to be quite honest. You must remember that Home Affairs is not integrated with the licensing department. So if I go with a ID document and I've lifted on the old green ID books, I've lifted that little plastic, I've removed that photograph and replaced it with my own photograph. I can go to the licensing department and say to them, look what my license has been stolen, and they will issue you with a temporary license and no questions asked. So that is a little bit of a gap. I know we're running out of time, so I can talk for hours and hours and hours on these things, but the long and the short of it is, if the dealerships can afford it, please make use of a digital identification and verification process. When in doubt, ask your DP, your key individual, somebody that can help you with identification and verification. Be careful of spotters. Be careful of cashback deals. Those guys get the finance approved with identity fraud, and they have no intention of paying that vehicle back. The moment you realize that it's a fraudulent deal, the car is cross-border, and if you don't have international or national roaming on the tracking device, it's very difficult to get that car back. Just follow the processes. That's very, very important.
Just speaking to a police investigator recently, and I know that you also mentioned it in one of our discussions, it looks like one of the things we also see is, or a telling sign is disinterest from the buyer. If the person is not actually that excited about the vehicle, or doesn't really care about the car, the color, or doesn't really argue with you or mind the interest rate that you're offering the finance to him, it's a good chance that this person is only acting on behalf of some sinister force behind them. And as you said, just asking for that cash back in their hand to leave should also give you a warning that this person doesn't have any intention of actually paying for that car, or actually taking ownership of it themselves. Any last thoughts, maybe, Greben, just starting with you? I think one of the key takeouts that I get from this whole discussion is that following the due process, even if you might know the person, even if it's month end, even if you're sitting on a number of deals that you have to close, even if the money's tight and you have to kind of make those sales. But just maybe a final thought from yourself, and then I'll go to Mark and end with Jeanette.
Yeah, look, I think my final thoughts is, Jeanette made some very good points, and I'll just summarize it for me, for the viewers in this way, is that the fraudsters are actually always 10 steps ahead. So if you think of the examples that Jeanette gave, those are actually very thought out, very complex, sophisticated acts of fraud that use a number of different perpetrators to make it happen. That's not just someone overnight, thinking I'm going to defraud a dealer and just once off, go and commit something. These are very thought out things. So there's a combination of things, I think, from my perspective, to solve it. So one, definitely, and Jeanette asked the question, those tools exist. So we can tell you that an email address was opened a month ago, as an example, right? Or you do the income validation checks. I mean, everything exists at a tool level. Then you have to overlay, some of Mark's comments as an example, where there's procedure and process. When those get broken, regardless of any tool that you have, you're going to have a loophole in your business, because again, the fraudster is 10 steps ahead and they're just waiting for that gap, right? So for me, it's about the balance and this holistic view of, let's understand what tools are available to limit the cost from a dealer perspective. The thing is as well, you don't have to use everything at every point in the process, but there's some stuff at the lowest possible price point that you can use very early on or upstream in your process, versus others, when it gets closer to the finance application or whatever the case is, then you plug it in. So it's about a balanced approach, and then you overlay the whole thing with training and making sure that there's a rigorous process, procedural way to handle it end to end, in terms of the entire dealer model.
Wonderful. Mark, maybe just on your side, some thoughts in closing.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, you said it really well, and Jeanette, your examples are fantastic. I think the last point I'd like to talk about is training. You cannot have enough training on fraud in your dealership, and then it's a great opportunity through your F&Is to train. And when you train your sales team, your back office team, your management team as well, all at the same time, it'll be rolled out very quickly, and it's very effective, and it doesn't take very long. So I'd just say add that point as well, plus everything else everyone else said. So cheers.
Fantastic. Jeanette, final thoughts?
Get a process if you don't have one, and follow it with no exception. If you can afford a digital identification and verification platform, make use of it. If you really think about it, if you compare the costs of identification and verification platform per deal versus the amount of money that you lose as a result of fraud, you need to do the numbers. But good luck, and when in doubt, just ask someone for help.
Sleep over it. Fantastic. I want to say thank you to everyone for your time. We've taken a lot more than we initially planned. We're going to combine all the insights and some of the graphs that Kreben also shared with us, some of the insights from NADA's point of view and AC Motor, and combine that into a white paper that will be downloadable with this webinar. And again, thank you very much to all our panelists for your time. I really appreciate it, especially on a day like this where everyone's busy.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.